So we're going to be talking about blockchain and reviewing what happened in the last year and also thinking about what might happen in the future. I'm going to introduce our panelists, who it's an honor to share a panel with. We have Reuben Bramanathan, who's product counsel at Coinbase. Reuben wrote and lectured the world's first postgraduate course on the regulation of digital currency and co-authored the Blockchain Token Securities Law Framework. He has been advising clients in the blockchain space since 2014 and regularly delivers presentations on the regulatory and policy challenges of blockchain technology. We have Daniel Dazza Greenwood, and he is the founder of Civics, a boutique provider of professional consultancy services for digital identity, automated transactions, data management, and technology strategy. Dazza is also a visiting scientist at MIT, where he is creating the field of computational law and building out MIT.edu blockchain research portfolio. As an attorney, Dazza served as both in-house and special counsel for technology law, representing corporations and governments as an intellectual property litigation expert. And Dazza has testified before the U.S. House, U.S. Senate, and other legislatures on electronic transactions law, and consults extensively the public sector, including to NASA as online identity expert, GSA as multilateral rules drafting expert, Homeland Security as a multi-state federated identity expert, and the UK Cabinet Office on population scale identity federation rules, and many other public and private sector organizations and global NGOs. Pat Berarducci, who's on the end there, does law and software at Consensys, a growing venture production studio with over 300 employees globally. And Consensys works directly with startups, large corporations, and nation states to deliver blockchain solutions based on both public and private Ethereum implementations. Prior to joining Consensys, Pat majored in computer science, researched and published on artificial intelligence, practiced law for 7 years at Sullivan and Cromwell, and was a co-founder and software architect at a health tech startup. Houman Shadab is a co-founder of Clause and professor of law at New York Law School and a director of the open source contract tech consortium, the Accord Project. He is a prolific and influential expert in financial law and regulation whose research focuses on financial technology and blockchains. Professor Shadab also often advises corporations, financial institutions, and startups, and has testified before the federal government several times, including before the Commodity Futures Trading Commission on Bitcoin derivatives. Nina Kilbride is head of legal engineering at Monax Industries, a software company developing ecosystem software from a toolkit of blockchain technology, smart contracts, and legal processes. Before becoming a software developer, Ms. Kilbride spent 18 years as commercial litigator in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. She has a JD from Wake Forest University School of Law and a BA for Southwestern University. Her blog on smart contracts and other projects are collected at ninakilbride.com. I'm Noah Thorpe, your moderator. I'm a co-organizer of the SF Legal Hackers Group, which we just recently restarted with Tony Lai, who's here. And I'm also the founder and CEO of Comakery, where we help networks of collaborators build products together and award tokens for code design and other contributions. Prior to Comakery, I co-founded Citizen Code, where I led blockchain innovation prototyping studio and implemented responsive organizational structures like Holacracy. Before that, I was the VP of Engineering for NASDAQ Private Market and also for SharesPost. Before we get started, I just want to do a quick audience poll, which is who here has owned a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, Ether, Ripple, or Litecoin without disclosing which one? Okay, it's interesting. I won't ask you the ICO question. Who's concerned about a potential ICO bubble? Okay, it's interesting. And who here is working on a project that incorporates a blockchain? Okay, cool. All right, great. So we're going to jump right into the panel questions, and I'm going to start with something a little more open-ended, which is what are you doing right now with blockchains in the legal space? And maybe we'll start with Dazza.
Great, thank you. And I agree, it's an honor to be on this panel. Some of these people I've wanted to meet for a while. So this has been a big year, I think, for blockchain, and I think it's evidenced by what I've been doing lately is stuff I couldn't have even done at the end of Legal Hacker Summit last year. Yeah. So in Massachusetts legal hackers over the last couple of plus months, we've had a collaboration with Toronto legal hackers to test the legal sufficiency of digital signatures that are generated from key pairs and blockchain addresses. And it was pretty hard, but at least it was doable to be able to reuse the key pair to digitally sign data like a PDF or JSON data. The frameworks and just the design patterns and just enough people that knew what that was all about were not readily available. And I don't think I would have had the idea to do it at the end of last time either. So we did that, and we're going to do a mock trial in the next month or so, which we've been practicing. I think the major thing, though, is what I talked about last year was the need for using a blockchain for the law itself, for statutes, for regs, for legal documents. I called it lawchain.org. Now, thanks to a couple of legal hackers, I've been introduced to Integra Ledger, and it's a David Fisher's thing. And they're actually going to be using Hyperledger for a legal industry blockchain, a generic one, to identify entities and documents, matters, very infrastructure kind of stuff that we could build upon in a reasonable way, like other sectors that have successfully transitioned to a digital footing. So I feel like things are really coming together in a great way, and in my case, MIT is great, and startups are great, and commercial clients and government's great, but there's no single place that I've learned more, been able to collaborate or innovate more than through legal hackers on blockchain, especially as applied to law. So that's the current status, and seems to be getting better.
Cool.
So I'm Nina Kilbride. I'm head of legal engineering at Monax, and for the past year, since we were here last year, we've been working on executing those things that are going to be necessary in order to bring all these long tail pie in the sky blockchain dream use cases to life, which is really boring. It's like being plumbers maybe, except for if you really like that thing, which I do. So, first we're dealing with things like financial market infrastructure. What does it really take to make a viable financial market infrastructure that complies with what we consider now as lawyers existing best practices, but then takes into account and begins to bring to effect the potential that technology has to do with that. So what does it take to do a issuing and paying agent that complies with global specifications? Then how do you quantify spread and mitigate risk, for example, reinsurance, along several layers of risk? Once you finish that, we're ready to start doing the exciting long tail use cases, and that's basically where we are now. We've kind of got a lot of the plumbing finished.
Excellent.
So I'm going to be a little controversial and talk about ICOs real quickly. Even though I raised my hand to say, yes, I think we're at risk of an ICO bubble, I think what's super interesting is that it's the first real world use case for smart contracts. So putting aside the regulatory issues, of which there are many, it's actually the use of issuing, accepting payment for, and executing a bundle of digital rights, or utility. So this whole process has been automated through ICOs, and I think that didn't exist a year ago. It certainly wasn't used a year ago, and I think that's a particularly exciting proof of concept for smart contracts.
Here at Clause.io, we are working on implementing blockchains for use with smart legal contracts, and blockchains or blockchainy technology in the sense of may not fit the definition of blockchain, could be distributed ledger, something more broadly conceived, or just something more decentralized. And I think it's not so much about blockchains per se, as that is a term that's given these days, I think, to refer to a wide group of technologies, including sort of distributed file storage, distributed networking that may not exactly chain data and transactions in quote-unquote blocks. And I think that's the sort of important question to ask, is not so much if it's Ethereum or Bitcoin per se that you're going to use in some way, but sort of what is your approach to decentralized computing, which I think is sort of the future, including with open source technology. And the Accord project that we're also launching through Clause is trying to answer and develop standards with respect to open source tech and standards and uniformity to some extent that's needed in the smart legal contract space. And I think ICOs are a great example of sort of use case for that approach to standards and why it's needed, because certainly things are working now, but there's probably an approach that can be improved upon to the extent that parties sort of agree upon how things can be structured and implemented, whether it's on a blockchain or not. And through just sort of being an academic, also sort of teaching and writing about blockchains and relevant technologies, and becoming sort of an advocate for thinking about things from a technology point of view, which I think everyone in this room is already on board with, including, again, through a decentralized approach, which I think makes sense for a lot of reasons, but not every use case, and also open source, which I think is just necessary component of the future, and now, of course, too.
Pat?
So at Consensys, pretty much everything we do is blockchain based. We do everything from startups to working with large corporations, nation states, cities, really just kind of run the gamut of everything you can imagine in terms of blockchain based technologies and solutions. And obviously the crossover between what we're doing, what we're imagining, what we're hoping to do, there's a lot of crossover with laws and regulations, both existing and what we might want to have in the future. So we spend a lot of time, number one, trying to understand what current legal frameworks are, regulatory frameworks are, and number two, we also spend a lot of time thinking about how these frameworks can be improved to really take into consideration the possibilities that blockchain can really unleash for not only the companies and countries and things that we're working with, but really just kind of society in general. So we really view it as a really important thing to be thinking about and working on. We're also, kind of more specifically, we're working with one company, a startup. It's called Open Law. That is, it's just launching. It's really exciting. It's kind of a next generation smart contract. It deals with open source contracts and automated signing and execution of smart contracts that are embedded within the contract. So we're really excited about what that can do for the legal industry as well.
Great, thank you. Nina, you have a role that is fairly kind of a new role that's emerging, which is you're the head of legal engineering at Monax. Could you tell us what it entails to be that legal engineer or head of legal engineering, and just what path you took to wind up in that role?
Sure. Well, the first thing is we sort of felt like we needed a different term to describe what we do. We're very legally sensitive in all of our work, but it's different to execute technology that you think will work for broad use cases than to practice law, because for legal engineering, at least at this point of the technology, we're more dealing with advanced process engineering. What are the systemic functions that are common and horizontal and cut across use cases, and how do those things need to be able to work in order for X, Y, or Z use case to exist? So that might mean anything from deconstructing a problem in order to design a solution or a system, sourcing humans and technological solutions to cobble together what needs to happen to make this big problem be solved, because usually the solution is not contained within any one entity's wheelhouse. But then it also comes down to executing with a team of varied subject matter experts, developers who all have very high-level skills or just granular skills too, domain expertise in their particular segment of the stack, figuring out how we all coordinate it all together and then make sure it's going to pass a lawyer's smell test. And so, yeah, it's a really fluid job. Yeah. But it is the most fun job I can ever imagine having as a lawyer.
Right.
And It's almost as if I get to play Lego with the universe a lot of days. And it came from, after 18 years of practice in pretty small law, I saw that blockchain could solve a lot of the solutions that made, that number one, made it easy, that could make it easier for more entities to be included in the economy, to reduce some of the barriers that my clients who might be small or medium-sized businesses had vis-a-vis my clients that were the biggest banks in the world. I graduated law school before e-signatures were a thing, so I'm just right on the cusp. So the standard of care in commercial litigation was so low back then that 6 weeks after the bar exam, I got thrown out to try a jury trial solo for a global finance company. That standard of care is unacceptable, I think. I mean, it went okay, but that's not, the entities rightfully began to push back on law firms using their matters to cut their associates' teeth. So over the years, those entities who had the understanding and ability and willpower to execute legal technology systems coded out my job, number one. So that particular cutting your teeth on litigation for finance companies, they're not paying for that anymore. That job is gone. But we've come to a really sophisticated level of legal process automation. Blockchain is going to allow that revolution in both value chain optimization and legal services delivery to a much broader spectrum of commerce, not just my clients who could afford anything they wanted. So,
thank you. I wanted to just sort of do a quick question, just like one or two words from each of you on what you think were some of the greatest technological advancements, blockchain technological advancements in the last year. Just like what's sort of top of mind that is the best, and maybe we'll start down there with Pat if you're ready.
ERC20 tokens.
Great. Do you want to explain what an ERC20 token is and why it matters?
I was trying to follow directions, yeah.
Sorry, it was a good one.
No. So ERC20 tokens, it's a little bit what Reuben touched on earlier, just within the last year. An ERC20 token is essentially a standard for creating what are called tokens. You've also heard ICOs, initial coin offerings. Some people call them coins, but essentially they're these digital representations of really anything. I mean, they're fundamentally programmable assets. They can represent a tokenized stock or a bond in a corporation. They can represent a beer debt. They can literally represent anything you can imagine. And this has just all kind of come into fruition in the last year and really opened up some really exciting new business models and ways for capital formation, like Reuben touched on. And I think it's just the beginning of what we've seen in the last year.
Great. Houman.
Yeah, maybe not so much technology from my point of view, but initiatives like consortia that have developed. Like I do think the Enterprise Ethereum Reliance, the IoT consortium for blockchains also is good and important because it beyond any specific technology, it gets people talking and collaborating and being open about what they're doing. I think for the long term, that is really important for the blockchain ecosystem in general and just the economy as a whole.
Great.
I got to agree with Pat. This last year is all tokens. That's the hugest development in my mind as well. If I can answer the question in a different way, next year I would predict the biggest technological innovation is going to be blockchain governance. We've seen problems with the Bitcoin network and disagreements fundamental to the existence of Bitcoin recently, and so we're going to see new models emerging. There's new blockchains being built with governance mechanisms. So that's my prediction.
For me, the most exciting things that have happened haven't been the ones that get a lot of press releases, and those are the people that I would definitely call legal hackers, whether or not they have a JD or not, who have taken this technology, analyzed a commercial system, found a place for themselves in it and put out a production model that actually gets them enough revenue to keep the lights on. So those are the people that I think are going to be most transformative, but they're not the folks that we're hearing a whole lot about. It's really exciting to hear about the consortia and the huge amount of awareness that we have, but my bias is I'm geeked about the use cases.
Dazza, yeah.
Cool. I think over the last year in particular, the big news for me has been, well, some of it people have already said, like one-liners that are good for technology, but the stuff that I've used mostly would be components that would allow people to have a job title with the word engineer, like Nina, who are also lawyers. And so there's been the maturity of components that are composable within a system, so that you could begin to support and reflect the requirements of, say, a transaction or even a business model with reusable components. So what I'm thinking about, number one, is a bunch of systems, kind of like what Nina was starting to hint at, where there's a smart contract on a blockchain that represents the boundaries of the system. So there's a couple of solar panel like grids, that one of which I'm involved with, where the whole thing's set up on a smart contract. So the energy creation is metered and tokenized, the usage is metered and tokenized, the payments, and your lights go off if you haven't paid after a certain amount of time. I think modeling Nevada utility law or whatever. And that's cool. So now you've got coterminous boundary point for a legal business and technology system with these weight-bearing beams of identity and transaction and units of value, all of which align in the contract and the governance and the system. So having composable pieces like key pairs that we can use to sign things, and smart contracts that are conceived of as what I would have probably done as a consortium or a bylaws or some kind of like trade association agreement in the past, are terrific composable pieces to actually apply this technology to business, legal, and technical systems.
Yeah, I'm going to throw in that I think the advent of self-sovereign identity that isn't associated with a server as an actual thing in the world is progressed quite a bit in the last year, and so I'm curious to see how that evolves. And to come back to that, actually, for you, Dazza, do you want to talk about some of the advances around digital identity that are happening?
I do. When you were saying it, I was thinking, I hope we can talk about identity. I mean, arguably, that might have been what all of us talked about, in terms of what's important. And it's not popular yet. I don't think it's really hit like above the fold of news, but there's tectonic things coming together to cause, number one, an address on a blockchain, like what you would get if you had a wallet on Bitcoin or Ethereum, to people understand how that can be an identifier and a usable endpoint for digital identity. Humongous. And that's the essence of the digital signature app I was mentioning. More to the point, utilizing that to represent a role, such as I live in a system like a community that uses this energy system, and
right.
to, for my utility bills, or to agree to changing the bylaws of how we'll be governing disputes or what have you, or just to sign, like a statement or an invoice. Really, really actionable. And then finally, what people are trying to do in, I feel, more applied ways now, to allow the address on a blockchain for any person outside of a role or context, but just because you're a human and you have an address, you generate a key pair one day, as is your like autonomous right as a free person, not as like property, to let that serve as the root identifier that you can bring to a government for the beginning of, say, I don't know, like a passport or a license, or you could bring to an employer on the first day as part of like I-9 onboarding. You could bring to a university to get a university account, something that is yours, that adheres to you as an autonomous person, that consents to be governed and can revoke consent. That's a great usage of a distributed system that no single government or power can shut off, and that has perfectly good public-private key pair that we can use at an address that we can point to. So I think that's the big news, is people are figuring out how to digest and use the service and the components for identity in the big sense, but also in the narrow sense, like as in a role as an employee or a transactor in a system.
Yeah. Yep. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that? Yeah.
So I completely agree that the idea of a self-sovereign identity is really exciting. One of the things we're doing at Consensys is we're working with a company called Uport, and they're doing several interesting projects, but one of them is actually they're doing a pilot program with Zug, Switzerland this fall, where Zug is actually going to recognize these the Uport blockchain identities for their citizens, and that can obviously open up a whole world of possibilities in terms of the way Zug can kind of deliver government services and even do things like voting or whatever. There's just the possibilities are really fascinating. And the other thing I would add to the self-sovereign identity discussion is it really has the ability to transform the way we interact with the internet as well. Currently we have our personal information stored on a whole bunch of different websites, whether it be Facebook, Google, whatever. And they kind of own our identity in a lot of ways, but the future of self-sovereign identity would allow us to maintain our own personal information. We control it. It resides on kind of our side of the internet connection, and we can selectively disclose what we want to whom we want. And as this idea of self-sovereign identity catches on, I think you'll see more and more products and web platforms where they accommodate that. So instead of, for example, needing to give Facebook all of your information to register, there very well might be, say, a social network where you disclose, what you want to whom you want, but the actual network itself is not housing that information of yours. So I think it's really some fascinating potential, and it's definitely an exciting area.
Did you want to weigh in?
Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to ask next, Reuben, could you tell us a little bit about, I'm going to jump onto this topic of ICOs and how tokens are used, because it's such a hot topic right now. Reuben, could you sort of describe to us how regulators are determining if a blockchain token is a security or not?
Sure. So I think until very recently, we hadn't seen much action at all from regulators in the space. But what had been going on is a continuous process of education on the part of regulators and them understanding the technology. And I think in particular, the SEC spent a lot of time trying to understand the technology and its potential use cases before issuing a report in the last couple of weeks. And then we saw a similar response from MAS in Singapore. So basically, looking at any particular token, which, as Pat mentioned, could represent theoretically any asset, any bundle of rights, any real-world asset or blockchain asset, looking at the characteristics of the asset behind the token, the use to which the token is put, and the reason for which the token is sold. So looking at all of these surrounding circumstances to determine whether or not a particular token is a security. And just to put a bit more clarity on that, if people are using tokens to try to raise money that looks like issuing equity in a company, then that's going to be a security, right? We have the Howey test, it's well established and it's pretty clear application. The challenge, I guess, is when we see tokens that represent things that don't look like any traditional financial instruments. They look like a right to use computer processing power or file storage or decentralized identity, and any number of use cases that don't currently exist. So I guess the SEC in particular sort of explained that not all of these tokens will be securities, but that securities law generally applies to blockchain-based tokens just as it does to any other instrument or contract.
Right. Houman,
Yeah, that shouldn't be too surprising. I think that the SEC's explanation was pretty expected and pretty straightforward with what is sort of securities law 101, the Howey test and the factors. But nonetheless, and it has introduced some, I think, skittishness probably on the part of would-be ICO utilizers. And nonetheless, I think for people in this room, it still could be a great method of collaborating on a project. I use that phrase instead of a great method of raising money, because if that's the case, then maybe not. Maybe just a simple Reg D or just traditional crowdfunding may be a good way to go about it. But if there's something that exists, it's a platform that's already out there also, as opposed to something that's only in white paper form. If there's something that is out there, it could be a really good way to bring people together to get the sort of grease the wheels running on it.
And do you guys want to put some more color on what would constitute an access token versus security, or if there is a difference, something that might be outside of the current framework?
So I think generally it's all still, nothing's black and white, right? The SEC said this particular token, the DAO token, was a security. They didn't say that any other token was or wasn't a security. But to your question, I guess, the divide that we're thinking of it, we put out a paper last year together with our friends at Consensys and a few others, looking at whether the token has an actual use case, right? It's sold like a product. It's sold because the people who buy it want to get access to this decentralized application. So people are referring to those as utility tokens. They do something. On the other side of the divide are things which just, okay, I'm giving you the profits from this company. You get a share of the profits, right? So those, I guess, two sides of the spectrum are kind of maybe more clear, but then there's any amount of things in the middle that make it harder.
Great. Who else wants to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll just echo. I mean, I completely agree with what Reuben's saying. I think that we at Consensys, I think we were not surprised by what the SEC said, and I think we were encouraged by the overall approach that the SEC communicated. Focusing on a case-by-case analysis, recognizing that there are very legitimate use cases for these types of token sales. And in terms of the difference between utilities and security tokens, I mean, as Reuben said, I mean, there's just the possibilities are endless for tokens. So it's hard to articulate a clear dividing line, and that's in part why it's encouraging that the SEC is saying we're going to take this on a case-by-case basis. But in terms of the utility tokens, one thing that you can see. Some of these utility tokens they function more as almost like a software license, right? Like they have the effect of essentially letting you access and do certain actions and things on this kind of next generation platform, and it's not even just necessarily accessing it, but the way the tokens can be defined, they really the users can really kind of be intertwined with. And become a part of the system as opposed to simply being, invested in the system or being served by the system. So I think that's one of the really exciting parts of this whole movement.
Can I offer a couple? I think Nina too.
Yeah, go ahead.
So this actually is a good entry point to a time-based, kind of like survey. So one of the major things I think that did happen over last year is this crisping up of now, I think, a discernible dance between the regulators and, in particular, the ICO aspect of blockchain use. That's a real good way to start the next year. So once there's a kind of a cadence and a rhythm, you can begin to make judgments and narrow and identify and move forward. There was a lot of, I don't know, like a kind of like Walking Dead kind of like shuffling in random directions, and that's scary to me in terms of relying on, big investment in technology when people aren't talking the same language and you're not in a dance with the regulators. So that's big. But now looking forward, I think it really comes down to some of the questions that were just addressed about identifying the nature of the asset. And so I think what we're going to see next year is a much better agreed sense of articulation between, and I'm going to just throw a word out here that hasn't been used, but a resource at the highest level, like the R in URL, like a resource at an endpoint that you can access. That could be an access right, like to gain access to a document. That could be, 10,000 shares of stock. But it's a resource that's at an identified place that you can do something with. Very generic. Then we need words for the type of resource that's fungible, property that's owned, and it's maybe of a security type, or maybe it's of other personal property type, like my poem or my song. And then we need words for other types of utilities, like CRUD, like it's an access right, or it's a different type of right that nonetheless exists absolutely at an endpoint that we can interrogate and operate a system based upon. So I think beginning to apply first-year law school concepts of property and ownership rights and obligations to digital resources, and then becoming more articulate about how they break down to assets that are securities and other types of property that we can have rights to that can be exchanged, is what I see developing next year.
As a person who was in small law, I look at how I would approach this from like sort of a bottom of the stack point of view, instead of creating securities that are going to work globally. Well, I apparently don't have any hobbies anymore, because all my hobbies are now, how do I make blockchain use cases? So the one I'm working on right now is, how do I answer some of these questions that we're talking about with ICOs? And you know, that we've got a problem with crowdfunding and accessing crowdfunding in the United States, and it is becoming very clear that we have some jurisdictional issues to work out in order to be able to get this global network working. So we're working on, I'm working on regulation crowdfunding in North Carolina that is intrastate and relies on a specific SEC exemption that I think 147A, that is only so far explicitly enacted in North Carolina, that gives us a lot more freedom from an internet perspective, and a lot less freedom on how much money we can raise. So there's a cap. But nonetheless, to articulate these small business open crowdfunding models in a way that is compliant and then scalable across US jurisdictions so that we can meet global requirements is a necessary step to reaching all these pie-in-the-sky use cases, like you were talking about with the solar panels and things like that. How do people access the resources to get their community into that system? And it's community-based crowdfunding. So that's what I'm working on.
So I want to, how many folks again are from outside of the US? You're here from outside the US? Decent amount. So I mean, I think the SEC rulings in the US are particularly important, and they also seem to extend out to, you know, anybody that's selling into the United States. But I'm curious how, let's see, maybe I'll actually start with you, Dazza, again. Yeah, just like how are the different jurisdictions that are out there? How do you see those playing out in the future? Like we have a town in Switzerland that is called Zug, which is attracting a lot of new folks. There's Gibraltar and Mauritius, et cetera, that are kind of taking up the charge around blockchainifying their infrastructure, and some of them aiming at being more ICO friendly. So I'm curious how you think that will play out in the next year.
I'm sure. What? Just slightly more crisp. Like
yes.
What will play? What aspect of?
Well, so in the U.S., the regulatory framework is very clear, whereas in these other jurisdictions, they haven't formed the same regulatory frameworks,
okay,
and so I'm curious how you see that as playing out. And,
okay.
and yeah.
Thanks. I almost answered the wrong
Sorry,
question.
yeah.
All right. Well, I'm just like rank speculation, but I would imagine it wouldn't be so different from, you know, history to this moment, and that it would look something like some jurisdictions might follow pretty closely what we're doing, and that we can expect to see some real experimentation in some, where you've got political and other reasons where conditions come together such that there's a new kind of model. And some of those, most of those will probably die. Some might survive, and we might see evolution in the models of regulation because of the laboratories of innovation we have in transnational law. I think there'll be some cool questions that come up in terms of capabilities of blockchain to allow better application of existing regulation, including to maybe have more context-sensitive ways to identify what jurisdictions apply to what layers of the transaction. So that will be interesting, and conflict of law things will be a laugh a minute.
Sure, yeah. And Nina, do you want to weigh in on sort of what ways that the blockchain itself may be able to assist investors in evaluating what to invest in, or whether it's a safe investment? Some of the roles that regulators might ordinarily do.
Well, I think the SEC they gave us a fair number of guidelines on that. And I think there are folks here that have done really eloquent statements of what you should be looking for. Kyle Mitchell's one of them over there. Yeah, lots of folks here, I'm sorry. So there are a lot of folks have talked about that, but I mean, you have the Howey test, you have what you're going to use it for, and I'm not sure I remember the question.
Yeah, I'm mainly thinking, like, let's say you live in a jurisdiction where, let's say you don't have the benefit of the SEC acting in your favor, and you're interested in using a blockchain. Are there some affordances that blockchains offer us that are similar to the way that regulators function?
Are there some what?
Affordances of blockchains that are possible to sort of fill in that gap for blockchains to be as efficient as some of the regulatory pieces in regulating those ICO markets.
Sure, but in real life, what I see is that it's more a matter of the regulator working with the blockchain to make sure that the regulator is being as soft touch as they can, but at the same time, they have a responsibility to make sure there's not an ongoing fraud in their jurisdiction, so they can't yet afford to be completely hands-off.
Right.
And so that's more where I'm seeing where, how do you make the regulator's job be really seamless and not very burdensome, while still trying to protect all the individuals in the system that is being regulated. And so that requires a balance between regulator perspective and user perspective.
Sure.
And so there's, everybody has to be at the table.
Right, right. Pat?
Yeah, so I would just add, you know, at Consensys, I mean, one way we really think about this is, I mean, our mission is really to further the blockchain ecosystem, and we recognize that we're not going to be successful building a successful blockchain ecosystem unless we achieve a lot of the same goals and ideals that the regulators are actually trying to achieve. Things like, you know, protecting users or people that are on the blockchain, things like, you know, rooting out fraud and things like that. I mean, you know, these are the goals that are fundamentally driving regulation and policy in all jurisdictions. And they're also goals that we who are, you know, creating apps and companies and things on the blockchain that we also share, and that I think we have to achieve if we're going to, you know, achieve real success with the blockchain ecosystem generally. And so there's a lot of and I guess to take that one step further, the point is there are a lot of really interesting innovations and use cases that we can perhaps come up with that accomplish a lot of the goals that regulators also want to achieve, leveraging these new technologies and innovations. And I think that's going to be a really exciting area too.
Right. So in the absence of clear regulation, I guess we're seeing some best practices emerge, or like we're learning lessons from past failures. So as the crowd sales for ICOs have emerged over the last few months or this year, we've learned lessons, right, as a community from crowd sales who haven't got their smart contract code audited, or who haven't set the right caps on how much money they want to raise or how many tokens they want to issue. And I guess we're, as a community, learning some of these lessons the hard way, albeit, but we're seeing this best practice emerge. So when the time does come for regulation, it's not emerging in a vacuum. We have some industry development as well.
And what is so cool about that, the rate of error, learning, correction, is the blockchain space is evolving so incredibly fast. Each time they make a leap forward that actually addresses a problem that they discovered. So while we've had a lot of lawyers, myself included, standing back going, oh, that's not going to work, that's not going to work, and, you know, okay, inevitably there's some crash, they fix it, they move on, they're learning, and they're doing it so much faster than we did before blockchain and network economies.
One very quick one. Okay. I was just thinking, well, that's a good question. Like what, and I was just listing out, I don't know, what are the capabilities, what are the, I don't know, like what are the commands that I could run and what do I get back, and how do you map that to specific regulations, but also the purpose of the reg? One is, and I noticed the SEC really harped on this with the Dow opinion recently, that you want to know if someone's an accredited investor, you want to know if they have a lot of money and if maybe therefore can be treated less with kid gloves. Well, be a piece of cake inside of cryptocurrency to say, well, show me proof of possession of a lot of money. Sign something from accounts that in the aggregate have over some threshold considered a lot, and then different lower key rules could apply for all of those people investing in your ICO. That'd be a simple one.
Yeah.
Digital signatures for consent and for acknowledgement, and legal notice, I think, is the big undiscovered country too.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a lot of rudiments. Well, there's a means of exchange. It's actually sort of a playground. That's a great question.
Yeah, thanks. Cool. I want to jump over, just switch topics. We've just Bitcoin has just forked into two currencies, and Houman, maybe can you describe what the fork is and why this Bitcoin fork matters?
Yeah, sure. I think it matters if you're a holder of Bitcoin, but I mean, you can, in a very broad level, and you can look at it as like a network upgrade, assuming you agree with the approach that was taken with the fork. But the idea is that with blockchains, or at least particular ones, and perhaps public ones in particular, there is a limit to what they can do. And in this case, there is a limit by design to how much memory and essentially transactions the Bitcoin blockchain could process. And in a sense, that's a good thing because it keeps what is being processed sort of clean and neat and straightforward. But the limitation on that is that there's only a certain amount of transactions that can be processed. There's a limit that was being reached, and then therefore the amount of the types of use cases you could use the Bitcoin blockchain for was inherently limited. And for example, you hear a lot of complaints by players in the financial industry that the Bitcoin blockchain is just nowhere near suitable for the amount and speed and volume and velocity of transactions that they would want to process to obtain the benefits of a blockchain. So there was or was not, depending on perspective, a governance mechanism by which to achieve the consensus, no pun intended, required to increase the block size or to change the fork the Bitcoin blockchain. And so that's what happened very recently. And most people, I think, and there's certainly disagreements about whether that ultimately is a good or bad thing, but most people, I think, would think that was a positive development, and certainly other people on the panel here can chime in on that. But that kind of brings us back to the idea of blockchain governance or governing open source software, maybe more generally speaking. And I think it also comes to the idea a little bit of, you talked about like a bubble in ICOs. You do want to think about, is there a bubble in sort of blockchain hype? Certainly there's a ton of interest in the technology, which is, I think, appropriate. But for any particular project or company or whatever it is, I think you do want to ask yourself, is a blockchain really needed for what I want to accomplish? Or maybe, and maybe in 5 years you answer that question differently, given the state of the technology in 5 years. Or are the costs not worth it? Or can I achieve similar goals, like a reduction or a lack of a central point of failure through other means by not using a blockchain or using something else? So it's something that, like any new technology, any change or upgrade, you just want to weigh the costs and benefits of everything.
Great. I'm just going to do one more question, then I'm going to go to your questions. I just wanted to ask Reuben, how does the SEC's investigative report of the DAO change or clarify the role of cryptocurrency exchanges? Because it sort of...
Yeah, so from our perspective at Coinbase, we operate, we have Coinbase, which is the easiest place to buy and sell Bitcoin, and we also have GDAX, which stands for Global Digital Asset Exchange, an order book platform for professional traders. So on both of those, we have to think about which assets we want to trade, which assets do we want to make available to our customers, and there's a bunch of different criteria around that. I mean, you have literally thousands of different digital assets, some of them worth very little at all and with very little use. So as Coinbase, adding any particular asset is our stamp of explicit approval of that asset for trading. And so we need to consider not only the security and the demand behind it, but also some of the regulatory issues, like, is this token a security? So there's, I guess we at least have some clarity from the SEC now about what types of things would most likely be a security. So that weighs into this sort of multi-factor decision that we would make.
Thanks. I want to go to audience questions now because we're kind of winding down the time. I just want to make sure we get some of your questions.
Two of them you sent.
One single question. Okay, no pressure. This guy raised his hand first. Yeah, I'm sorry. Right, how much Bitcoin do you have?
I guess my question is, how does the panel see the evolution of governance on blockchain, especially globally, given that anything that applies to blockchain applies to all of the participants, and as sovereign entities become more aware of it and become more involved, differences in opinion between, say, China, Russia, US, how is that going to kind of force the evolution of blockchain to either be global or have different pieces all over the world?
Who wants to get that one first?
I'll have a go. So one of the benefits is that an open public blockchain is not controlled by any corporation, government, or group, right? One of the challenges is that it's not controlled by any corporation, government, or organized group. So you have this distributed consensus mechanism, but every time it comes time to change or upgrade the rules of consensus, then we have the same problem that Houman just described, and we just saw with the recent Bitcoin fork. So I guess to answer your question a little in a different way is that the challenge for upgrading these and changing the rules of consensus is the governance challenge itself, separate from any sort of legal governance in that sense.
Pat, do you want to?
Sure. I think this touches on some really kind of interesting, perhaps even philosophical issues in terms of, you get into political philosophy and things like that even, but one idea that I think blockchain governance touches on is the idea of the ability to kind of govern by consent versus governance by coercion. And the really cool part of blockchain is that you're participating in a blockchain entirely voluntarily. It's entirely by consent. And so you can, in theory, have tens or hundreds or thousands of different blockchains governed by their own sets of rules and protocols that anybody can come up with. And if it's a good system of governance, more people can consent to participating in that platform. And I think the why that is so cool is because it allows you to achieve consensus without necessarily uniformity. There can be a lot of different ways of going about things. And if you contrast that with a system where it's just kind of everything's mandated for everybody, I think there you get, in theory, kind of coerced consensus, but or you have you have the uniformity. Everybody's doing the same thing, but you don't really have genuine consensus as to this is the right way to go. So I think that moving forward, the ability to kind of govern each other and ourselves by a matter of consent is going to really open up a lot of cool possibilities.
I think, just to jump in, I think that there's two things that blockchains have already done well that are international. One is the setting up the economic, this is for permissionless blockchains, setting up the economic incentives for chains to maintain their own existence, and also that the cryptographic elements of preserving your own private key work no matter what jurisdiction you're actually operating in. And so I think we may see soon other core constructs that are necessary for governing organizations across multiple jurisdictions that are sort of like primitives about how at least permissionless blockchains will operate. I think on the other side, we're going to see clusters of notaries that are located in specific jurisdictions, so that we can guarantee that a particular transaction takes place in a particular jurisdiction, and that's more kind of the ledger route rather than the permissionless blockchain route. So I think we'll see both of those.
I offer a challenge, I guess.
Yeah.
So I didn't have the faintest idea what the answer to your question was until these guys spoke. But it's very illuminating, I thought, and it sparked an idea, which was to understand better what the answer to the question is and how to align different governance schemes to the technology. Because honestly, the way we do miners in Bitcoin and the way Ethereum setup is hardly the only way you can do it. People are experimenting with a lot of different systems now. What if we had like a legal hackers pack where we took, say, just because many of us are familiar with it, the US Constitution, and then maybe did a profile of it, like a simplification, maybe like reduced it to a tenth of the back and forth. But you've got like 3 branches, you've got the origination of like a bill or a policy, you've got 2/3 for the veto, you've got the umpire who can change state. we could actually model that, and then you can imagine the documents they're doing. Hell, it could be a contract, it could be a policy for an agency, it could be a bill for appropriations, but it's a governance system. It's really well engineered. If you ever deconstruct the Constitution with like a pencil and just be like, what are the roles, what are the interactions, what are the dependencies, what's the sequence, what are the triggers, what are the state changes? These people were good. Like they thought this through. It's tight. It would be interesting to try to do that, not like in Perl or in C++, but why not do it as a smart contract? And as the essence of the underlying blockchain. So you have a consensus mechanism that aligned to the sources of power. Every individual user is consented, and then blah blah blah. They call into existence the system, and then you've got some states. Maybe that could be their local departments. You've got the federal government, and you cycle it through explicitly supporting and reflecting rules that are written down. We could all get a copy of it. We all kind of understand it, and we could model it and do it, and then learn more about how to apply any arbitrary governance scheme to a consensus mechanism in a blockchain, and then get a vocabulary and some capability to do that.
Yeah. Right.
Challenge.
Okay, so I think we got to wrap it up. Thanks for a great final question, and yeah, thank you to our esteemed panelists.